The engine room warning came again and again before the Americans fired, "Vacate your engine room. Vacate your engine room. We are prepared to subject you to disabling fire." For 6 hours, the message hung over the water. Then a destroyer put a round into the machinery space of the Iranian linked cargo ship Tusca, killed its propulsion, and Marines took the vessel. That is the image people will remember. But the image is not the deepest layer of the story. The real story is that Washington may have just changed the strategic meaning of Hormuz in front of the entire world. Not by making a speech, not by announcing another red line, by showing that the blockade can move from warning to damage to boarding to control in one continuous sequence. That sequence matters more than the ship, because Tehran's leverage in Hormuz was never based on the fantasy of defeating the United States head on at sea. Its leverage came from a different place. Iran's power was its ability to contaminate the strait with enough danger that nobody else could control it cleanly, enough mines, enough gunfire, enough fast boats, enough sudden uncertainty, enough market panic that every outside actor would eventually conclude the same thing. Whatever your opinion of Tehran, the price of excluding it from the arrangement is too high. That was the old logic. What happened with Tusca suggests Washington is trying to build a new one. The new logic is this: Iran can still make Hormuz dangerous, but danger no longer automatically means paralysis. The United States is trying to demonstrate that it can isolate Iranian-linked shipping, keep the broader corridor usable, and punish individual violations one vessel at a time. If that model holds, the meaning of the strait changes. Hormuz stops being a blunt geopolitical hostage situation and starts becoming a sorting system. That is why this moment is more serious than it looks. The real story is not that the Americans boarded a ship. The real story is that they are trying to make the blockade reproducible. Reproducibility is the key word here. One random interception is a headline. A reproducible method is strategy: track a vessel, issue warnings, apply disabling fire, insert boarding teams, search the cargo, then let every ship owner, every insurer, every refinery, every trader, and every foreign ministry watch what happens and update their behavior accordingly. That is how maritime pressure compounds. Not by stopping every ship, but by convincing the rest of the system that the threat is real enough to self-discipline. That is what Iran may have triggered without fully meaning to. When Tehran reopened Hormuz and then shut it again almost immediately when the IRGC threatened ships and opened fire, it was trying to recover the atmosphere of uncontrollable danger that once made Hormuz its greatest strategic card. But in doing so, it may also have handed Washington the perfect justification to move the blockade from a legal, political concept into a visible operating routine. Iran wanted the world to fear disorder. America responded by performing order, not peace, not resolution order. That distinction matters, because order, once believed, weakens Iran. S best instrument, Iran's old instrument, was the fear premium. Every spike in oil, every rerouted tanker, every insurer panic, every televised warning in the strait translated maritime danger into political pressure on outside governments. Tehran did not need to win militarily. It only needed to make the costs of excluding it travel outward through markets fast enough and widely enough. But that mechanism only works if the outside world believes the whole corridor is slipping beyond control. Washington is now trying to break that belief. It is trying to teach the market a narrower lesson. The water is risky. Yes, but the risk can be managed for everyone except the traffic we choose to target. If that narrower lesson takes hold, then the economic shock Iran relies on becomes less universal and more selective. The more selective it becomes, the less Tehran can turn global pain into diplomatic leverage. That is where the strategic reversal begins. Hormuz was supposed to be Iran's weapon. Washington is trying to turn it into Iran's filter, not your exports, not your resupply, not your sanctioned ship. Everyone else may pass, but you do not. If America can sustain that distinction, then the strait no longer amplifies Tehran's leverage in the old way. It traps Tehran inside its own logic. The same geography that once gave Iran relevance starts operating like a cage, but cages create desperate behavior. And this is where the story becomes dangerous. Because from Tehran's point of view, the Tusca incident does not present one clean choice. It presents a bad decision tree. Option one is retaliation. Iran can try to answer a disabling shot and a boarding with something sharper, more swarm boat pressure, more harassment, more mine threats, more drone attacks, more sudden violence around commercial traffic. That path would restore some fear. It would remind the market that no amount of American procedure can completely sterilize a 33-kilometer choke point under constant asymmetric threat. But retaliation has a built-in cost. Every new Iranian incident makes it easier for Washington to say the same thing to allies, insurers, and the market. This is why the blockade has to widen. This is why more boardings are necessary. This is why interdiction should move into the Gulf of Oman and beyond. In other words, retaliation may recover some leverage while simultaneously expanding the legal and political room for the United States to intensify the system that is hurting Iran. Option 2 is passivity. Iran can avoid a direct answer, reduce visible friction, and preserve what remains of the diplomatic track. That lowers the immediate risk of a larger military cycle. But it also carries an internal and external price. Externally, silence after a public disabling. And boarding operation teaches the shipping world that the American line is more solid than advertised. Internally, it tells Iranian hardliners, commanders, and loyalists that the state absorbed humiliation and gave no answer. That is combustible in a system already built on revolutionary prestige and resistance theater. Option 3 is diplomacy under duress. This is the option outsiders keep talking about as though it is the obvious off-ramp. It is not obvious at all. Visible coercion sometimes brings parties to the table, but it also narrows what they can admit in public. Every time Washington demonstrates procedural control, it raises the material pressure on Tehran, but it can also strengthen the voices inside Iran that say negotiation is simply surrender by stages. The more public the coercion becomes, the easier that argument becomes to sell domestically. This is the paradox at the heart of the blockade. The tactic can improve America's operational position while worsening the political environment for the kind of compromise needed to end the confrontation cleanly. That is why the system being built in Hormuz may be effective without being stabilizing. And that is also why the second layer of this story matters so much. Duration of visible success is not the same thing as a durable architecture. One ship can be disabled in an evening. Sustained maritime governance in a hostile choke point is something else entirely. It requires aircraft, refueling, ISR coverage, legal discipline, helicopter crews, boarding teams, repair cycles, command clarity, political patience, and constant calibration over which vessel to hit, which vessel to warn, and which vessel to let pass. That is a heavy burden. Iran, by contrast, does not need to build order. It only needs to keep injecting disorder cheaply enough and persistently enough that the burden of maintaining order starts to look strategically inefficient for the other side. That is the classic asymmetric wager. Not victory by overpowering the system, but victory by making the system too expensive, too fragile, or too politically corrosive to sustain. This is why people who see Tusca and conclude that the whole strategic question has been settled are moving too fast. The issue is not whether America can board. The issue is not whether Iran can still create danger. The real issue is which side can impose its logic on the strait for longer. Can Washington make selective order credible enough that the market, the insurers, and the regional shipping ecosystem start behaving as though Hormuz is open for world trade, but functionally closed for Iran-linked movement? Or can Tehran keep enough friction alive that every day of American enforcement becomes another day of elevated cost, elevated risk, elevated ambiguity, and elevated political strain? That is the contest now. And there is one more player in that contest, whether Washington likes it or not. China matters because the pressure game around Iran has never been only local. It sits inside a larger commercial architecture that Beijing helped normalize over years. Sanctions, workarounds, dark fleet practices, indirect routing, alternative payment channels, and a willingness to keep Iranian energy moving when Western enforcement tried to shut the door. If Washington is now shifting from blockade language to reproducible interdiction, Beijing has to recalculate, not necessarily publicly, not dramatically, but materially, how much Iranian-linked exposure will it tolerate, how hard will it probe the line, how much economic oxygen will it keep providing while trying to avoid a direct maritime confrontation with the United States. That calculation will quietly shape how much pressure the blockade can truly create. Because if Tehran retains enough external economic support, then even an increasingly effective maritime system may squeeze without forcing an exit. But if Chinese caution rises while American interdiction becomes more believable, then Iran's room shrinks much faster than its rhetoric suggests. This is why Tusca matters beyond Tusca. It sits at the intersection of three different tests happening at once: a test of Iranian deterrence, a test of American enforcement, and a test of how much external support can survive once sanctions pressure becomes physical rather than merely financial. All three of those tests are now running in the same waterway. So what comes next? There are only a few plausible paths. The first is progressive normalization of the blockade, more warnings, more selective disablements, more boardings, more quiet rerouting by commercial actors who decide the safest path is simply to avoid any vessel, cargo, or transaction that could draw American attention in that world. Tehran loses room not through one spectacular defeat, but through accumulation. The second is broader Iranian disruption, a larger tanker incident, a deadlier swarm boat, clash mines, drones, or sudden strikes designed not necessarily to sink American power, but to wreck, poison the whole maritime environment, and prove that no procedural system can destabilize Hormuz without Iranian consent in that world. The crisis escalates because Tehran decides a dangerous strait is still preferable to a governed one. The third is an uneasy middle, partial enforcement, partial leakage, continuing pressure, no real settlement. America proves enough to keep the blockade credible. Iran proves enough to keep the corridor tense. China adapts quietly. Markets stop panicking the old way, but keep pricing a permanent risk premium. The result is not resolution, but a new, harsher normal. That middle path may be the likeliest. Because what happened with Tusca did not resolve the argument. It simply changed the balance between threat and method. Before, Hadninchun's greatest asset was the belief that Hormuz could never be governed cleanly against its will. Now Washington is trying to break that belief vessel by vessel. That is a very different kind of struggle from the one most people think they are watching. It is not simply a contest of fleets. It is not simply a contest of nerves. It is a contest over whether the world's most dangerous energy corridor will be governed by generalized fear or by selective enforcement. That is the deeper shift hidden inside one disabling shot, and that is why I think Iran may have made a much bigger mistake than it understands by reopening Hormuz and then turning it dirty again by threatening ships and firing into the corridor. Tehran may have created the one thing Washington needed most: a public justification to demonstrate the blockade as an operating system rather than a paper declaration. Once that demonstration exists, every actor in the chain begins to update: captains, insurers, traders, refiners, governments, rivals, allies. And when behavior changes, strategy changes with it. That is what makes this moment so consequential. The United States did not just seize a ship, it tried to teach the region a new reality. Hormuz will no longer be negotiated first and enforced later. Hormuz will be enforced first and negotiated afterward. If that logic sticks, then the strait has already entered a new era. And for Iran, that may be the most brutal part of all, because the danger now is not just that Washington can fire. The danger is that Washington may have found a way to make firing look repeatable,